Welcome to the Daily Objective, day 81 of the war in Israel. I'm joined by James Valliant for a very important episode that perhaps we should have done earlier, but we will do right, which is about the Oslo Accords. We titled this episode somewhat provocatively, The Oslo Accords, Israel's Real War Crime. Uh, I chose that. I'll explain why. But I want to say just generally, for some shows require more preparation than others. This show for me for this particular episode, the preparation was the fact that I was 11 years old, living in Israel when the Oslo Accords were signed. I, of course, was a very happy 11-year-old to hear that peace is finally here, and there won't be any more wars, and so on. Um, I kind of sarcastically nowadays refer to people who were born around that year or shortly before, shortly enough that they don't really remember the times, before Oslo, as the peace generation, because this is the generation that all they've experienced in life is peace. The peace that was signed between Israel and the PLO, the peace that we all saw what it's like. It's said in Israel that the left, the Israeli left, has pretty much died off. Now, I don't think that's true. I think the right kind of became the left, so there's no reason for the left. But yeah, the left-wing parties that were very prominent back then are no longer around because their ideas have failed in reality. We're going to talk today about that failure. I just want to say one thing about the little preparation that I was doing for the show, and one thing I did was I went on YouTube and I searched the Oslo Accords, and the first result that came up, I want to read the title of it. This was from the History Channel. The title was "How the Oslo Accords Almost Ended the Israeli-Palestinian Conflict." And this video is from 5 years ago. Of course, 5 years ago, the situation was not fundamentally different from today. 5 years ago, we knew what we knew 10 years ago, 15 years ago, and a year after the Oslo Accords were signed, that the result of the Oslo Accords were more war, more death, and it's directly has directly led to where we are today. James, your initial thoughts on the Oslo Accords and anything else around them, like how they're being perceived or
Well,
promoted in our culture.
I was a bit older than you when the Oslo Accords happened, and I was not happy about them. I knew they were a disaster. I knew they were a downright evil compromise. I knew that the idea of going back to the 67 borders in itself is an irrational idea. The idea of Israel giving up territory that it needed to defend itself, from which attacks had been launched against Israel, was bad in principle. I knew that the United Nations was absolutely the wrong way to frame this. And more fundamentally than that, I knew that negotiations with the very parties involved were misbegotten, because I understand that that kind of compromise is a moral compromise on principle that can only lead to disaster. I hope that Daniel includes in the show notes some of the quotes I have from Ayn Rand on compromise and where a valid compromise is possible. And it's only possible where there's a shared value, shared interest. And that should have meant, at a very minimum, well, first, you can't negotiate with people who don't share your values or are bad faith actors. More than that, as a precondition for it, I would think anyone can get this, because it's not nearly so restrictive. As a precondition for any negotiation, you have to recognize my right to exist. Not just a framework for recognizing my right to exist at some future point, which is all it was. And if you walk in saying, no, my charter says I'm hell bent on your destruction, and we'll discuss my charter. No, no. That's the kind of compromise that Ayn Rand specifically says is immoral and self-destructive, and a compromise on principle, not the kind of valid compromise where people share a value, share a principle, and are just dickering over the details. I knew it was corrupt from the beginning. I knew it would be a disaster from the beginning, and here we are, 30 years later, facing October 7th. Shows you just how successful it was.
Yeah. So if we go a few years before the Oslo Accords, late 80s, early 90s, the Intifada starts, the Palestinian uprising, Palestinians, attack soldiers. It's not the kind of attacks that we know today. It's more they were throwing rocks and so on. But it was violent. It was a violent uprising, and this led in 1991, I believe it was, to the Madrid conference where Israel first took kind of its first step to say, look, we are willing to negotiate, and we are willing to negotiate with ultimately the PLO. Now, in 1992, when, as far as we know, the official negotiations started with the PLO, this was under Yitzhak Rabin, Israel's prime minister from the Labor Party. Officially, the PLO was a designated terrorist organization in Israel, and at least the law that was on the books was that negotiating with terrorists is an act of treason. Now, nobody has been tried for that treason, and what bothers me today is that some of the architects of that catastrophic agreement are still out there saying how what we see today is a result of Israel not properly doing its part to make the Oslo Accords happen. So they were signed in 1993 between Israel and the PLO. Yasser Arafat, who headed the PLO, devoted his life to terrorism. He and many of his terrorists were brought from Tunisia into the West Bank, into Gaza. They were given control of some territories there.
Yes, terrorists were brought in at this time from other places. I remember distinctly at the time. No, the guy had not renounced violence. He was encouraging more violence at the time, and we all knew it.
Yeah, yeah, and that part of the agreement was that he would renounce terrorism, which is a very weird, thing to say. Okay, we'll give you what you want, just renounce terrorism. When again,
Stop killing us so much. Yeah.
and the terrorists are militarily weaker than Israel, so Israel could win that militarily, but that option was off the table. And yeah, so the agreement was signed in September of 1993. In January of 1994 was the first bus bombing in Israel. That became a regular thing. This became a thing. Now, this was done by Hamas, but Hamas had now, instead of having to deal, and instead of having to work around the Israeli military, they had to work around the PLO. Now, the PLO were happy for Hamas to do their thing, and they
Yes.
can't take the blame.
Well, and they were using it publicity wise. Oh, look at those guys over there. If you don't like us, you got worse over here. So our promise to not kill you quite so much, you see, and that's exactly the context it was at the time. And again, of course, our friends with Hamas are killing innocent civilians. That is their MO.
Yeah. Now the PLO, did their bit in killing innocent civilians. Maybe not around that time, but that was
Well, they slowed down around that time so that they could negotiate and sucker Bill Clinton and the rest of the world into these international negotiations, which is exactly what they did, if memory serves me correct.
Yeah. Now, of course, we can't talk about the situation in Israel without talking about the current Prime Minister Netanyahu, who was the leader of the opposition during this time, the
At
leader
that very
of the
time.
opposition, and the leader of the protests against what the government was doing.
And I have to say, at that time, I had a much better opinion of Benjamin Netanyahu. I actually thought he was one of the really good guys through the 1990s and even the early 2000s. I thought that he would, if he did take power again, that geez, might things get better. But this last round of Netanyahu has actually kind of helped lead to October 7th. And I'm willing to criticize the Israeli government at this point, even though initially I was reluctant to do so because of October 7th. But yeah,
Yeah.
Netanyahu's own policies have been a disaster in his latest administration.
So on the point of Netanyahu, I want to thank Gail Parker for her super chat, and Bonnie Bertrand. I want to thank you for being a member of the YouTube channel for 19 months. Bonnie says, were there any prominent dissenting voices at the time? Any voices of reason and integrity? Yes, Netanyahu was a not just a dissenting voice, but he sounded like a voice of reason. So back then, not supporting Netanyahu would have been I think, the wrong thing to do. Netanyahu had been Israel's ambassador to the UN, and he was great at that. And he was great as the leader of the opposition, calling out the left-wing government for what they're doing. He was fantastic at it. Then he did what he's done throughout his career, which is he got to power and he did exactly what he had been criticizing the whole time. He kept up Israel's part of the agreement, added additional parts of the agreement, gave additional territory to the Palestinians, to the PLO, and famously said at some point, I think it was after he left office, he said about Yasser Arafat, "I respect him and I even like him." Which,
like him? You can like a killer, like a monstrous killer like that? Anyway, yeah. It turns out Netanyahu was a big disappointment.
Yeah. And so this continued for a while. Under Netanyahu, there were fewer terrorist attacks, which of course, was a moment where I'm sure people were saying, "Oh, look, the Palestinians actually aren't terrorists." Then in 2000, when after Netanyahu had lost, he had been prime minister, he had lost. Ehud Barak was the prime minister in 2000 when he and Arafat went to Camp David, and under Bill Clinton's presidency, were discussing what the long-lasting peace would be like. They were very close to an agreement. Ehud Barak gave them everything they wanted, pretty much.
Everything they wanted. Every principal thing that they came in wanting was given to them. Really, in fundamentals, every single one. You're right.
And then the Second Intifada was launched. Now, the Second Intifada was much worse than the First Intifada.
Yeah.
It involved terrorist attacks. It got worse. We've spoken a few times in the past few months about the lynch in Ramallah of 2 soldiers. This was at the very start of the Second Intifada. We speak about it because we're making the point here about how important it is to understand that the Palestinian people are the enemy, because the Palestinian people, when they heard that there were 2 Jews in Ramallah, all marched there to lynch them. And March 2002, daily terrorist attacks in Israel. Israel eventually goes on some military operation in the West Bank, a ground operation. Many soldiers die. The West criticizes Israel for supposedly killing civilians. In one instance, in an operation in Jenin, there were headlines around the world that 500 people had died. This is a number that the Palestinians, it works for them because they say it and the world repeats it, as we saw with the
BBC will be sure to repeat it within an hour, right? Yeah.
Yeah. And of course, later on, we found out that the number of dead was 52 on the Palestinian side. The number of dead Israeli soldiers was 23, and many terrorists. If only 52 people died, many, and most of them were terrorists. Many terrorists got away because Israel chose to do a ground operation, put their soldiers at risk, and allow.
I just want to say here, Razi, Israel, if what the critics of Israel are saying is true, they do a very lousy job at genocide. Israel is probably the worst. When you compare it like to the Nazis and the Armenians after the Christians, this is pretty incompetent. Just with conventional weapons, just with their conventional missiles and airplanes, forget the nukes that Israel surely has, just with conventional weaponry, they could annihilate the population of Gaza tomorrow. The West Bank as well, but they don't. So you guys, I gotta say, every Israeli out there, even Israelis with dual citizenship, you really want to write a letter, because your government is really lousy at genocide if that's their goal.
Well, a couple of days ago on the Daily Objective, Mark Pellegrino and I were talking about Cenk Uygur's debate with Douglas Murray. The title of that episode is "The Cenk Who Cried Genocide." I recommend anybody who missed it, you should watch it. And so I was looking at the comment section, and somebody mentioned or claimed, you don't understand what genocide means. You don't actually have to kill anybody. And it can still be a genocide. You remove the population. I don't remember exactly the explanation, but yeah, this is a thing. We were talking in that episode about the definition of genocide. I read the Oxford Dictionary definition. I read the Cenk Uygur definition. They're not matching. And yeah, you can make any sound, give any definition to any sound and say this is the definition of that sound, or that combination of letters, and that's a big part of what the
The
anti-Israel
whole
crowd does.
goal is that everyone knows that in the last century, the great victims of a real attended genocide are the Jews. That's why that word is being used. That's why that word is being used. The Israeli military operations that we're seeing here, never have there been more surgical, more, more actually risk-taking on the part of a country to prevent civilian deaths on the other side in the history of warfare. It's the opposite. Had to get off that off my chest. Sorry, Ross.
Yeah, and actually that point is relevant to why I gave the title, this episode, the title I did, Israel's real war crime. I mean, that
Yeah.
what we got from Oslo is war. Israel got more war and more death, and that was the result of it. And that should have been known beforehand. If you say, okay, this was something we didn't think about before, but now that you people have terrorized us for a few years, now we will give you some of what you want, and just promise to stop. And of course, they continue, and then they get more. They continue, and then they get more. And go ahead, but I had one other point.
No, but it's the policy of Israel. It's the policy of America. We keep encouraging and rewarding their bad behavior. Yeah, kill more civilians. That'll be your entree. Take hostages. That'll be our negotiation. It's evil. It's evil. It's evil. What Israel and American governments do in compromising, negotiating these hostage deals, it's all of it corrupt, and it's necessarily doomed because you're just rewarding bad behavior. You're going to get more of it. Promise.
So we talked about how the rational thing to do in the mid 90s would have been to support Netanyahu. When I first voted in an election, it was in the Israeli prime ministerial election. Israel, this weird thing that they did with the system there. Twice in Israel's history, there was a direct vote for prime minister. Usually you vote for a party, then there's a coalition, then whoever has 61 votes is prime minister. There was prime ministerial elections twice. The first one, Netanyahu lost to Ehud Barak. The second one, Ehud Barak lost to Ariel Sharon. And now I did what I think was the rational thing to do at the time as well, and voted for Sharon, who said he would respond militarily to Israel's enemies. And of course, he governed as a left winger. He did respond militarily a little bit, as I mentioned. After March of 2002, he did go on a military operation in the West Bank, and then ultimately there was the issue with Gaza. Now in Gaza at the time there were Jewish villages, settlements as they're called. By the way, tomorrow's episode is about settlements, and there were rockets. There were small rockets, not what we see today. They would fire them mostly on the villages in Gaza, some of them on Sderot right next to Gaza. And Israel decided then that the right thing to do in order to protect its citizens was to remove all Israeli presence, civilian and military, from Gaza. And the argument, and this was under Sharon, and the argument that he made was that once there's no more Israeli presence, there's no occupation of Gaza, then if one rocket falls on Israeli territory, we can go in and do whatever we want. We have full international legitimacy. By the way, very similar to what Rabin said about Oslo, that once they're
1 month of Hamas taking control of Gaza, they were lobbing rockets at Israel. Within 1 month, and they continued. There were pauses, but they just continued lobbing rockets and rockets and rockets. People don't realize, they say Israel's cutting off the water and electricity to Gaza. Well, you know who built most of the infrastructure in Gaza? Israel. Israel had settlements there. They were putting in real infrastructure there. And when they left, they left a bunch of that infrastructure, but they left. The Israeli presence went, and unilaterally Israel said, okay, Palestinians, you got Gaza. They've been ruling it now for 16 years, and within a month of Hamas taking over, they were lobbing rockets at Israel.
Yeah. Now, Sharon had some opposition. So he had this plan. He said, we're going to have a referendum. Then he changed his mind and he decided to have a vote, sort of referendum within the Likud party. Now, I was a member of the Likud party back then. I went and I voted, and I remember Sharon was expected to win. He was a very popular leader of the party, and he didn't win. He lost by a landslide this referendum. And he said before the referendum, the result, that is what we do. That's what, we're going to have to follow the result. Of course, immediately after he lost, he went ahead and did what he wanted to do, and he faced some opposition within his party. The leader of the opposition within the party, an official leader, was Netanyahu. And I remember because I watched live the vote in the Israeli parliament. Netanyahu and two or three other senior ministers were not inside the parliament when the vote was taking place. They were outside. They were talking about it. Sharon said anybody who votes against this will be kicked out of, will be fired as minister. And then Netanyahu and his colleagues, his allies, came in and they vote for the plan to leave Gaza. And later he explained, and you can see Ehud Olmert, who became Sharon's successor, and he was his right-hand man, laughing. I'm sure you can find video of this, laughing at Netanyahu, rightfully so, for capitulating as he cowardly does throughout his career. And he explained it as, I thought it was better to oppose it within the government. No, he didn't oppose it. It happened. He didn't change it. He's been in power for most of the years since then, and he hasn't changed it.
To change it? Did he ever suggest changing it?
Well, he's not even really suggesting changing it now. He says Israel is going to have some control of Gaza for a while or something like that. He's not suggesting bringing back Israeli settlements or anything like that. So this wasn't meant as a rant of Netanyahu, and I think we gave a good amount of context of what Oslo was and the years since. But yeah, since Netanyahu has been in power, this is 30 years. He's been in power for very close to half of the time since the Oslo Accords. He is very much to blame, and again, the results are deadly to Israelis and continue to be deadly.
Yes, and there will be more October 7th, ladies and gentlemen, unless policy on Israel and America changes so that we have some moral backbone with these monsters. Expect more. You're inviting more.
Now, if you think, okay, well, Netanyahu is so bad, there must be a much better alternative. So the leader of the opposition in Israel, Yair Lapid, is in agreement with the U.S. government that Hamas should be removed from power in Gaza and should be replaced by the PLO. The PLO headed by, the Palestinian Authority, which is the PLO.
Authority, whose leader is Abbas. Yes.
Yeah, the man with the PhD in Holocaust denial from the University of Moscow. And again, this is a continuation of Oslo. The idea is what we need to do is continue Oslo now after Hamas is removed from power.
Suicidal compromises that didn't work 30 years ago are still setting the moral agenda for these things. Talk about corruption. Talk about counterproductive. Talk about, if that actually happens, it can only mean the slow death of Israel, the slow death of civilization in the region. And that is what apparently we're morally committed to in the governments of Israel and the United States. Very sad.
By the way, something else I saw in the comments of one of the episodes where I criticized Netanyahu was, somebody said, well, who's going to replace him? It's probably going to be some progressive, or I think that was the word used. Now, the thing with Netanyahu is he needs to be removed for what he has done in power. You cannot leave somebody who is such a failure, the worst prime minister in history. If whoever comes next is worse, then you remove that person as well. But you cannot allow somebody who has not just let October 7th happen under his watch. He didn't become prime minister on October 6th. He's been prime minister for all this time. He's allowed this to happen. He is now choosing not to act with the full might of Israel's military. And that's all there is to it.
The fact that his policies led to October 6th in itself. Now, obviously, what's happened since is it just puts it in italics and it puts an exclamation point after it. But just the fact that it happened, that he could allow this to happen, should be enough to kick him out. But that shouldn't bring about the peaceniks taking over, nor should it bring about. And I hope that in this context today, Israel isn't even tempted that way. But I don't want the ultra conservative religious people in charge, but I sure don't want right now the peaceniks in charge, the compromisers in charge, to put it that way. But I hope Israel, and here I have to ask my Israeli friends, do you really think that even with the removal of Netanyahu, they'd go in a compromising direction?
Well, so I don't know that anybody is actually good. I don't think there's anybody who would be good. I do think if Gantz, for example, the defense minister, who I don't like at all, if he was running this, I can't imagine him running the war as badly. He would not execute the war as I think it should be done. He would go out of his way to protect civilians, but there were news reports that right after October 7th, or on October 7th, he said, we need to preemptively strike against Hezbollah on the Lebanese border. And they struck first, and Netanyahu said, no, the Americans won't allow it. So yeah, I'd rather have, just on that point, the guy who said yes to preemptively striking against people who we know would happily do something and could and have the ability to do something much worse than October 7th. Let's prevent that rather than
I understand it was just a few hours ago that the United States, after more than 100 attacks from Iranian proxies, has finally started attacking Hezbollah interests in Iraq and Syria. One in the latest attack on American bases at Erbil, I believe, there were three people injured, one critically injured. Of course, Biden said we have to wait for someone to die, but at least we're now getting some attacks on Hezbollah interests from America, long overdue. And I understand they just started last night. I hope they kill as many Hezbollah and Iranian operatives as possible. But America has just now decided to do a little something in response to all the Iranian attacks that have been over 100 from Iranian proxies, including Hezbollah in Syria and Iraq. America really needs to take on Iran directly. The Houthis, of course, but they're just agents of Iran.
And every day that passes that America doesn't do this, every day that passes, every attack that passes, America is sending a message to its enemies: we're not going to do anything to defend ourselves, let alone our allies. So
international shipping.
Israel is doing the same, and of course, Biden before October 7th was giving money to Iran, also giving money to Iran so that they don't build a nuke and harm us. So yes, this policy, Israel's policy on Oslo is the policy of the West, the policy of America. And these ideas, one of the reasons why I've been saying over the past 3 months that I'm so pessimistic is that it doesn't seem to be there doesn't seem to be anything that could happen in reality that proves to these people that the way they're running things against our enemies is the exact opposite of how they should.
If the history of the last 16 years, if the history of the last 30 years, if the history of the last 40 years, if the history of October 7th cannot get through and penetrate about the failure of this, my whole lifetime, it has been a bunch of pleas for compromise with murderous monsters, and it has failed. So if all of that, and if the atrocities and horrors of October 7th is enough to get the world's attention, I have to agree, Razi, I really don't know. Decades of failed policy, the horrors of October 7th. If that can't slap you across the face with some reality, these people are disengaged from reality, and obviously I have to be as pessimistic as you are in the long run.
And James, speaking of reality, we are out of time because the reality show follows. Now, I've gotten worked up, and I'm going to be on the reality show. Luckily, the reality show, we're going to talk about Netanyahu's op-ed in the Wall Street Journal from yesterday, and the Gaza mayor's op-ed in the New York Times from yesterday. The New York Times, in case you didn't know which side they're on, Now you know. We're going to talk about this. Starts in about a minute after we go off the air. We just need to switch Zoom calls and everything. But thank you, James. I think this has been we've both gotten worked up, but it's been a worthwhile episode. If you if you share my view of that, then please share the video as well, like it, and if you're not subscribed to the channel, this is what we talk about every day. So
You know the unique value we're providing here, and a position you're not going to find anywhere else. Pay for that value, ladies and gentlemen. It's a value for value. It's a win-win, and it's really the only hope for the world, getting this perspective out there.
yeah, and as I mentioned, tomorrow we will talk about the settlements, because we keep hearing from many on the anti-Israeli side that the settlements are the reason there's no peace. Watch that. We have the answer to that, but that is tomorrow. The reality show starts in a minute. Thank you, James, and we'll see you soon. Bye.